Okay. People have a place to sit and some coffee this morning. And I can hear that you can now hear me. So, welcome everyone to this seminar entitled A Humanitarian Crisis on the Doorstep of Europe, Drivers, Dynamics and Challenges of Increased Migration Across the Mediterranean. This is organized under the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, which is supported by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And my name is Inger Skjelsbæk. I am the Deputy Director at Prio, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Prio and to today's event. The seminar is organized in cooperation with and with the support of the MFA, the Section for Humanitarian Affairs, in line with their awareness that there is a need to better understand the dynamics behind the increased migration flow since 2013, and in order to define the best responses. And I know that the seminar has been in the making for some time, and I think we can only acknowledge that the theme has become even more acute during this planning process, and I think the attendance here speaks to the urgency of the situation. We will hear from many experts. We will hear about what it is that entail, or what the causes for, or the drivers for people to flee are. We will hear about concerns for the receiving communities, the EU, for humanitarian and security concerns, and I'm sure that we will learn a lot. The seminar builds on long-standing research at Prio within different research groups, Migration Group, which we'll be presenting here today, as well as the Security Research Group. They are both groups are also proud to host a number of Norwegian and international experts here today. But before I give the word to State Secretary Ingvild Stubb from the MFA, a few practical pieces of information are in order. So at the risk of sounding like an airport stewardess, I am going to say that in the very unlikely event of an emergency, we will go out that way and out the main door, and we will meet over here by the Dagens Næringsliv building. So everyone knows that. The event is being filmed and streamed, so everyone who speak loud and clear and introduce yourselves well if you have questions, so we know who you are. Toilets are down the hall, 3 toilets, and coffee and lunch will be served in the room where you had coffee when you arrived this morning at the break. You'll see that in the program. And now I'm very happy to give the word to Ingvild Stubb, State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who works with EU issues. So very appropriate that you are here, and we're looking forward to hearing your remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Inge. Deputy Director, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to speak about an issue that is as heartbreaking as it is urgent. The very dramatic humanitarian crisis that we see on the doorstep of Europe demands immediate action. This is a very timely seminar, and it shows that Prio can react rapidly to issues that are of prime political concern. We face, as you all know, a very complex crisis. It involves a wide range of issues: border control and immigration, European asylum policies and obligations, human rights and humanitarian and development policies, fragile states and conflict prevention, the law of the sea and search and rescue regimes, security policy, and the fight against criminal networks and human trafficking, to mention just a few. And we approach these issues from different perspectives. Nobody has as yet come up with a comprehensive solution, but if you do have one, please let me know. Short-term responses may undermine durable solutions, but long-term policies will not save the people that are in risk of drowning today. The only thing we know for certain is that no action is not an option. The influx of migrants across the Mediterranean and the tragic loss of lives is affecting us all. Under the Schengen Agreement, Europe's external borders extend from Italy in the south to Norway in the north. Europe's southern borders are therefore also our borders. The crisis in the Mediterranean is at the top of the EU agenda, just as it is at the top of Norway's agenda. The various European countries, of course, are affected differently. Challenges differ between the countries where migrants disembark and the countries of final destination. The EU countries have, despite their differences, put forward a broad and ambitious programme for tackling the crisis. The European Commission has presented an agenda for migration. It contains wide-ranging and sometimes controversial proposals, and it will be the subject of intense discussion in the weeks ahead. This crisis is affecting us all, and the response must therefore be a shared responsibility between European countries. The Norwegian government wishes to contribute to alleviating this crisis, as the Prime Minister has said, among many other occasions, in a letter to Presidents Juncker and Tusk. We are also carefully considering how we can complement EU efforts and support other stakeholders, such as the UNHCR, the IOM, and regional organizations. While we strive for a more comprehensive response, Norway has set policies and identified some very urgent policy initiatives. First of all, we must act to save lives. This is our #1 priority. This is being done today by various ships patrolling the Mediterranean under Operation Triton, Operation Poseidon, by commercial ships and ships with a search and rescue mandate, including those run by private and humanitarian organizations. The ship provided by the Norwegian government will be a substantial
Right. Sorry about that. I've got quite a lot of words and slides, which I hope are useful and will increase our knowledge, but certainly it'll hopefully raise some questions. Set up? Great. So I've been asked to, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to be here in Oslo. Thank you. And I've been asked to, this is the title of my presentation, which I realize is a bit tabloid journalism, if you like, exaggerating the issue a bit in the way that they do often. And we're going to explore issues around these from the perspective of the Horn of Africa. So let's go straight in. I'm going to look at the movement a little bit, some generic trends, some of the protection risks, the criminal opportunity, which is really the migrant economy, which is critical. We live in a globalized world. We need to rethink some of the drivers and some of the contradictions. Let's look at the migrant perspectives and the non-migrant perspectives a bit, and then look at some definitions, and finally some thorny questions. I've got 35 minutes, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, but I may not take all that time. So quickly, something interesting about the Horn of Africa is that people leave in all directions. The one everyone's very interested in is here, but in fact, there are a lot of people going north through Egypt and previously into Israel until they completely sealed their border early in 2013. But even so, about 4,000 Eritreans are leaving, they estimate, every month, for example. Going east, which is the area we focus on a lot, into Yemen, and they're not really going to Yemen, they're going to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Peninsula. We've seen about 6,000 per month on average over the last 9 years. 80% of those are Ethiopian. Going south to South Africa, not such high numbers, but the same group, Somalian, Ethiopian. And obviously that's been disrupted a lot by recent xenophobic or Afrophobic attacks that have been going on down there, which have actually been going on quite a few years and has slowly been reducing the number of Somalis in particular going down, making the Ethiopians going south the more numerous group now. And finally, the one that is bothering Europe so much is Horn of Africans coming through, and others obviously coming through Sudan, Libya, and crossing into Europe. I think the estimate last year is that 20% were from Horn of Africa, which would make it around 44,000. Looking at some generic trends, what we've been seeing over the last few years, is that it's more complex. We've got multiple drivers going on, which is why we call it mixed migration, mixed irregular migration. So we've got regular and irregular, forced and economic, and other groups, traffic people as well, all mixed in these movements that are more or less being handled by, but not exclusively by, smugglers. There's rising vulnerability, more exploited, not just by criminals and criminal groups, but also local communities, state officials all over the place are profiting massively from the sort of unbridled flow of migrants and people on the move, whether they be refugees or economic migrants. So, that's an interesting point because it's growing in number, as we know, but it's independent of specific crises. So take example, the drought in Somalia in 2011, 2012, causing a large group of people to move into Kenya and into Yemen. When the drought ended, we didn't see a big reduction in the group going to Yemen at all. So the same number were moving. So we're seeing movement. Let's say Ethiopia isn't at war, doesn't have massive drought. It has other problems, overpopulation. There is sort of lack of political freedom and expression there, and soil infertility and things like that may be causing movement. But we're not seeing the movement being directly related to crises when it's mixed migration. Obviously, refugee movement, for example, Burundians right now are moving in direct response to the instability there. But in the general flows going out in the four directions, we're not seeing it related to crises necessarily. Less toleration around everywhere. I'll come on to that later. It's a high profit and low risk business model for smugglers and traffickers. At the same time, we're seeing quite a lot of confusion how to respond. Exactly as you say, it's a complex issue. There's non-harmonized policies in place, or they're not being implemented, or they're being breached. That's just as true in Europe as it is in East Africa, with all the different protocols about permitting movement of people. And there's little understanding, although it's increasing, about the scale, scope, and conditions of mixed migration and the dynamics of mixed migration. And the dynamics are what interest us so much. And more people are understanding the scale, scope, and conditions because it's become such a hot issue and high on the agenda. Let's look quickly at some of the protection challenges. If it's not a humanitarian crisis, which I realize is the title of this, this meeting, then certainly it's a human rights crisis. It'd be interesting to know how it is a humanitarian crisis. Certainly we view it as a human rights crisis. Because what we're seeing is that on top of the high-risking behavior taken by migrants, we're seeing these categories that are greatly affecting their human rights, if you like, and their vulnerability. The commoditization of migrants in recent years. They're literally being treated as commodities, being sold from one gang to another, being expendable, as commodities may be, basically just commodities in an industry that is billion-dollar industry now, if you take the north of Africa and Europe. Criminalization of migrants. We see a lot more migrants in detention and being criminalized. As criminalized, instead of administrative law, they're coming under criminal law, particularly in East Africa, and I think in other parts. We're also seeing criminalization of the smuggling culture that was previously much more consensual and less violent, and it's become more criminalized with traffickers and extortionists, criminal gangs getting involved. And we're seeing massive collusion and corruption by state officials. There's no way that these people can move anywhere without total involvement by state officials, everywhere. And that includes in parts of Europe as well. They are the lubricant, they are the oxygen, if you like, of the whole migrant industry. It seems to have stuck. Yeah, there's some confusion and cynicism concerning asylum, refugees, and other migrants now. The currency of refugee regime is under threat and under stress. I think everyone in this room knows that. As long as we have mixed flows, we're going to see that only increase. And skepticism and, if you like, cynicism around genuine refugees and asylum seekers is going to increase. And I think we've seen that all happen. So that's how their protection challenges are one of the major protection challenges for genuine refugees and asylum seekers. And finally, sorry for those at the back, it says the commercial power of smuggling and trafficking. I think, is Ruben here? Sorry, are you going to talk about the economics of migrant? Right, so I'll just do, there's just one quick slide then that just have some indicative estimates of the figures that we've put together. Perhaps the one that's most interesting is this one by an author who put it as 600 million euro last year was the money being made. Although interestingly, the Migrant Policy Institute in 2010 claimed the crossing of the Med was worth 2.6 billion, sorry. And there's some other ones there. What's interesting to me is that a lot of the money being made is in some of the most remote and porous parts of the world. So if you think these are quite large sums, you need to multiply it by about 100 to get an impression of what the power that has in the local economy. Maybe 100 is too high, but certainly by many factors, to understand what power that has in the local economy, and how in some of these places it is the economy of the port or the area or the towns along a certain route, and therefore very entrenched, and therefore involving many state officials and very permitted and not regarded necessarily as illegal or negative at all, and quite the opposite in many communities. In Yemen, we also have an issue of hundreds, if not thousands, every year, girls completely disappearing off the radar, female migrants who arrive on the shores there and disappear. And there must be a whole trafficking industry there that's been under-examined, and the Yemen government certainly isn't paying any attention to it. And there must be millions of dollars involved in that as well. On top of that, these don't include the extortion levels. A lot of migrants are being extorted en route. So that's separate from the fees they pay. And Studies that came out last 2 years have shown that possibly €500 million was extracted between 2007 and 2012 from Eritreans that were kidnapped and tortured in the Sinai. Again, many people in this room will know about that terrible caseload. So we live in a globalized world. We've got widening gulfs. I mean, it's quite frightening times we live in. And if you look at the range of division, if you like, that exists in the world, but there are some big bridges, and the big bridges are the ones that relate to migration. We have globalized communication, critical. Satellite TV, social networking, massively used by smugglers and migrants alike, and refugees, asylum seekers. People are seeing the other side of the world, if you like, through MTV, through all the films they watch, through streaming, through telephone communication, proximity with relatives in the diaspora. Globalized communication is a really critical link in why, anyway, what we believe is why migration is rising so fast at the moment. Again, globalized transportation. I mean, it may not look like it with these sort of little fishing boats coming across, but in fact, it's not just fishing boats that people are using. People are using ships and aircraft and trains and vehicles, trains, buses, cars, everywhere. I mean, the amount of roads and infrastructure that allow people to move rapidly ahead of the police, as if the police would stop them anyway. So globalized transportation makes everything far more possible. And then globalized crime. There are numerous studies showing how crime is always many steps ahead of crime prevention, international crime, and they're doing very well on this business of human smuggling and human trafficking, as we know. For example, just 250,000 of UK passports are lost every year, let alone any forgeries. So you imagine that in all the European countries, how many there are passports floating around for sale for people who want to buy them. And these are the richer migrants that we don't generally see because they don't end up on the boats or don't end up dead on the shores. So getting caught up in mixed migration flows means getting caught up in the dark side of migration. This is the intersection between globalization and international crime. But what's interesting is also that studies show that relative income disparity is more disturbing to people than absolute income disparity. The global inequality is high, but unlike before, people are seeing it and they're feeling it, and they want maybe the possibilities that they're seeing and hearing about more immediately. Obviously, geography and climate and rough seas are no respecter of status. When I talk about status here, I'm talking about the status between an economic migrant or an asylum seeker or a refugee. And the facilitators and exploiters of those on the move are also no respecter of status. They treat refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants and trafficked people the same. So, sorry, again at the back. In this context, it may be misguided to think that poverty eradication and sustainable development, both very slow, will reduce current mixed migration flows from sub-Saharan Africa, especially from the Horn. And this is pretty critical because in most international conferences and debates, the issue of poverty eradication and sustainable development continues to be the root cause of people's movement. And I think we think in RMMS, it's very important to widen the examination of this. And so we're going to look at some rethinking of drivers right now. Let's look at some push factors. Obviously, a lot of them are overlapping and interwoven. There's the obvious ones of poverty and conflict, environmental stress, resource competition. We've got a young population, high fertility that doesn't look as though it's going down very soon. A lot of unequal distribution. This is in the global south, if you like, and particularly the Horn of Africa. We've got governance issues. A lot of the states are quite predatory. They're certainly chaotic and disorganized. Poor health facilities, poor education, and more critically, poor education returns, meaning what parents invest in education, they don't see returned in the incomes that people get, partly because salaries are so low. We've got underemployment as well as underemployment. We've got limited democracy, all these absences, a lot of intolerance. There's traditional harmful practices people want to run away from, tribalism, marginalization, and corruption, crime. And last one, aspiration and adventurism. And this is an important one. It's going to appear in the next list, which is, of course, a sort of corollary to the first list, which is pull factors. So here, a very interesting study in Britain 2 years ago, a quick one on the streets of London, asked migrants if they had to choose one word What was it that they loved about being in England or in Britain? And it was freedom. It wasn't money, it wasn't jobs, it wasn't being with, it was freedom. So I think we often underestimate the cultures that we offer migrants beyond just the jobs and the away from their own violence in their own countries. It's freedom, political and personal freedom that many have never experienced before they come to Europe. There's also a rights-based social system and justice system, rule of law. Obviously the opportunities and jobs, education, salaries. Diaspora is quite important when there's an existing community to come into. Organized, reliable state structures. All these things that act as a really interesting pull factor for many people. Aging population, so there's lots of opportunities. We've got low fertility in Europe. Obviously security, and again, aspirations and adventurism. I think we shouldn't underestimate, as I said, the power of that for a lot of the young men, and they are generally young men coming, you know, as I probably would do exactly the same in their situation. You know, the idea of going to Europe or going somewhere better. It's a big adventure. There are risks, but it's fascinating and almost irresistible. And your aspirations are permanently being fed by success stories of people who've made it. But, so in the last decade, we've seen a lot of transformation in the Horn of Africa. We've got pretty buoyant and growing economies in those countries. You might look at the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and see that the Horn of Africa doesn't do that well. But relatively speaking, it's doing very well. It's in the last 10 years, country by country, historically speaking, it's been transformed. So if the conditions and opportunities were worse 2 decades ago, and if there are more jobs than the economic boom in the 80s and 90s, why are we seeing such a rise of economic migrants at the moment? And not only that, but if it is just poverty and economic opportunities, then why don't we see poor Kenyans, Djiboutians, Ugandans, Tanzanians, and other groups in the flows? Why are the flows so narrowed down to a few countries? Eritrea, yes, a very oppressive regime, but Ethiopia, oppressive to some, but not for others. In fact, it's economic boom at the moment. And Somalia, of course, has been there for 20 years with its problems. But if it's just poverty, we should be seeing other people. And why, too, is there not much more south-to-south migration in the region if it's just economic migration and refuge-seeking behavior? So we see culture of migration as set in, but not uniformly. And I just thought this, I mean, it's a very obvious fact, but if you look at this UN-sponsored World Happiness Report, which is very multi-indicator built, you know, obviously, you know, migrants seem to be coming from the bottom 20% of that ranking and going to the top 20%. You'd be happy to know Norway's way up there, I think, with Iceland as one of the top 2 or 3 in the world. So there's a lot of cynicism. And the complexity of the situation has led to a lot of knee-jerk reactions. Knee-jerk, I didn't mean that in a pejorative sense, but maybe unreflected in reactions of the European response to the drownings and the deaths. This is actually a cartoon from 2 years ago. There's another one. But the truth is, there are contradictions and there are different voices. So we've got, if you like, the liberals on the right wing. We're using terms like hard right to describe anybody who is sort of wants to be reflective or careful about the numbers coming in or allowed to come in. And as a result, it's been becoming a divisive and top agenda issue. We've got a widespread call for rescue, but at the same time, in the countries listed there, we're seeing very strong anti-migrant feelings and expressed politically as well through different political groups. It's interesting, if you take UK, for example, I mean, I could add many other countries to this list, but the last 3 or 4 are obviously related to what's going on now in Indonesia. But it is interesting, in the recent election in England, the Conservatives won, but as you may know, Britain doesn't have proportional representation in its system. But if it did, UKIP, which is a very anti-migrant group, and its main agenda is anti-migrant, would have 83 seats, which is half of the total Labour vote. They got 4 million votes which is 13% vote. But because we don't have proportional representation, they ended up with 1 seat. That may please some people in this room, and myself, but it does indicate that the importance of the subject to the Brits and to other maybe parallel to other countries in Europe and Norway, how important this subject is, and we can't ignore it. At the same time, an OECD report last year, that was looking towards 2050 said that Europe and USA needed 1 million migrants every year if it was to maintain its economic situation, growth, its way of life. What do we do with that information? At the same time, sub-Saharan population, 900 million now, could be 4 billion by the end of the century. Its section is part of the world with the highest fertility, I believe, than any other part. Does this feed into this? But then what about this? Same time, IOM and now EU want to see 20,000 resettlement places shared across Europe. That's going to be one of those, I think, very contentious issues that you mentioned earlier. And so the other side, we've got Italians saying there's another 1 million would-be migrants in Libya waiting. That's not IOM, that's the International Maritime Organization, claim that there's 500,000 that will come this year, and they're expecting at least 10,000 deaths. So I think we've got 2,000, almost 2,000 deaths now. We've got another 5 times that figure to expect, if that prediction is correct. On the other hand, we've got migration transition theory, which some of you may know about, and it's looking at migration down through history, and it shows that actually increased prosperity increases migration in the short and medium term. So I'll come on to that in a minute. So is this a flash in the pan? Are we in this age of migration as part of the modern global transformation? We've got a situation of asylum versus security. ISIL are claiming they intend to send 50,000 fighters to Europe through these channels. A smuggler on the BBC a couple of days ago said they're already sending fighters, and they extract 10% tax from the smugglers in Libya at the moment. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's certainly what we're hearing increasingly. No wonder some countries are viewing this as a major security threat as well. And perhaps the contradictions at the moment are epitomized by the call for rescue on one hand, as you said, primary cause, motive is to rescue lives. But at the same time, there was a unanimous vote on late last week to create a naval blockade of smugglers on the Libyan coast. So in terms of reality check, let's look at an optimistic scenario coming back to East of Africa, Eastern Horn. IGAD, by the way, is the East Africa bloc that includes Djibouti and Eritrea and Ethiopia, Kenya. And so because of migration theory, we know that even if in the most optimistic scenario, we should expect an increase in people wanting to leave that region. If we go to a less optimistic scenario, where we see regional conflict, environmental stress, development inequality, and governance problems, which perhaps are more likely than the optimistic scenario, we'll also see migrants increasing. So the root causes are not always desperation. The pull factors are also very compelling. And as long as refugee status and asylum is available elsewhere, refugees will move with the migratory flows. So let's look at the migrants' perspective. They make their own risk assessments, just as anybody would. Take a young person. He may try to settle in his country, but he finds he cannot, and he can't make a future. So he pins his hope on going to Europe or elsewhere. There are others that don't even bother. They don't even try to settle. They've started dreaming about going to Europe from a young age. A lot of their colleagues and friends at late school and university, or tertiary education anyway, are moving off right away. They've got dreams, aspirations, they're feeling adventurous, pretty fearless, risk-taking. We did a study of knowledge, attitudes, and practices of Ethiopian migrants in the Horn of Africa. We found that they were extremely aware of all the risks that they face. From rape, including mass rape, to robbery, to death, to abduction, to abandonment, to thirst, dying of thirst or starvation en route, any of those above, they were very aware of the risks, and they were still taking, engaging the smugglers to move. How many times have we heard, "I'd prepare to die than to return home"? We see repeated attempts. They only have to succeed once. And they've got time. There's nothing else happening in their lives as far as they're concerned. There's no opportunity cost. They can just keep on trying. On the contrary, it's the value of them getting to Europe is huge, and however many months or years it takes them. This is the perspective we're seeing. Anyway, look at the risk. Deaths in the Med last year. The death rate was only 1.6%. I say only, guardedly, and so far this year it's 3.8%. And in May, one weekend, there were 6,000 that crossed and only 10 were found dead. That's a 98.4 success rate. That's pretty good odds if you're a betting person and you're a young man thinking, "I want to try this." All those odds look pretty good. And anyway, the smugglers don't care. The deaths and abuse don't affect their business model at all. There seems to be an endless supply. By the way, crossing to Yemen from the Horn of Africa is a 0.2% risk. There is a particular reason for that, though. The deaths came right down when they started holding migrants for ransom very successfully in Yemen. So now a migrant arriving alive on the shores of Yemen is more valuable than a corpse, and because they sell them to the criminal groups. So that's also why we saw a big reduction in the deaths in Yemen in the last 2 years. They also have soft landings from their point of view. There's an existing African community in most of the countries in Europe where they're going. Profiling is publicly unacceptable. So it's easy to live under the radar, especially in cities. No one's going to ask them any questions unless they get into trouble. There are active NGOs, civil society organizations that support migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. There's all kinds of protocols, conventions, laws, protecting the rights, and offer chances for appeal. This is from their perspective. You may disagree, but this is their perspective. Once they're here, right at the bottom it says 39% of rejected asylum seekers in Europe in 2015, sorry, that should be 2014, were not returned. Again, from their perspective, very good odds. So from the 55% of people who were rejected last year, only 39%, sorry, only 61% were returned. 39% slipped into Europe and are presumably still here now. So again, the odds are very good from their perspective. Let's look at our perspective, if you like, or non-migrant perspective. They are stretching definitions and challenges and our assumptions. If we consider this changing environment, we too are very challenged by the concept of mixed migration. A lot of people here probably spent many years working with refugee law and asylum seeker policies and issues, but I think we're all being challenged by what we're seeing now. Sorry, that's not a very good picture. So what do we see when we see a bunch of people on a boat like this? What are they? Well, this gent, who's doing quite well. Most migrants would see him as a dream fixer. He thinks of himself as a successful businessman. He probably thinks he's looking after his family, and that's the best thing he can do. See, all kinds of terminologies now being bandied around about these people who are on the move. Nomads pastoralists in Kenya, for example. Are these going to be future migrants? Who's this woman? Is she a sex slave? Maybe she's just a domestic worker, a businesswoman, stranded, victim of trafficking. I think we're all struggling with the definitions that we've been brought up to understand and the conventions we've been taught to respect in this current flow of mixed migrants from the Horn of Africa and everywhere else. So I'm just going to end with some thorny questions. So if the push-pull factors are considered, it will be increasingly difficult to stop migration, despite the fact that we can expect a major collision between rising migration and policies of the North. Is it correct to say that because they take the risks, they must be desperate, and what they're fleeing is so bad that they should be treated as refugees? What we may regard as high risk, they may say as low risk. Should the failure of developing countries to establish national systems of their own constitute a humanitarian crisis for Europe? Will opening the borders solve this issue? People focusing on the idea that supply and demand of European economics will define how many migrants will be here and shouldn't be here. Maybe it's not enough. When we look at the perceived benefits of simply being in Europe, from the migrant's perspective, even unemployed. Must the closing of legal avenues for entry into Europe automatically mean illegal methods will thrive? In the current climate, yes, but look at Australia's no boats policy. On land, we are also seeing fences built between Greece and Turkey and Bulgaria, around Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. This isn't necessarily our position. I'm just throwing out some questions. Will legalizing and organizing migrants reduce smugglers' predatory hold on the trade? Can we legalize enough migrants to satisfy demand? Is Europe a victim of its own success and now caught up in its own standards and norms of rights, values, ethics, and therefore tortured over the current migrant crisis? Last page. Has Europe been too permissive? It's a free-for-all. Are Europeans being taken advantage of? This is what we're hearing from smugglers. They're telling migrants, potential migrants in West Africa, go now. It's chaos in Europe, and this is a chance of a lifetime. You're going to get in, because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to do with us. We're too many. That's what we're hearing. I know this was a very contentious issue last year at the rescue, at the dialogue, the UNHCR dialogue meeting about, it was completely taboo to suggest that the rescue boats were a big pull factor. Now I hear a lot more people are talking about it as a potential pull factor. As I mentioned, even though, anyway, the point I made earlier about the migration policy cannot be in contradiction to the labour market, or else the pressures will be too much. Is it inevitable that Europe has to develop a more open migration policy? And so is migration the unfinished business of capitalism, as somebody, I think, from ODI in London suggested in a recent article? That basically it's inevitable. If capitalism is to continue in Europe, we have to bring migrants in, and therefore we have to open the borders and change our policies. It seems like there is a unified and strong response, or there is one developing at the moment, controlling migration. Let's see if that works. Interestingly, and possibly cynically, could Australia's tough approach to migrants work in Europe as a humanitarian response, i.e., as I think, what's his name? Rudd, the Premier of Australia. Sorry, Tony Abbott. The only way to stop the deaths is to stop the boats. And do migrants have the right to gain access to Europe by virtue of having got themselves onto the Med waters? Is this a fair system? Doesn't it reward the smugglers and reward the most able or courageous or foolhardy of those wanting to access Europe? What about all the others who didn't take the road to Europe but have equal claim to the same asylum seeking or refugee justifications for their situation? And finally, will our failure to enact a more robust response now merely create conditions where people of Europe and politicians will demand a more extreme response in the future? Will it be too late then? Will extremism, social disruption, racism, and even terrorism be some of the outcomes? So finally, it's not mixed migration, it's migration. It was just such a good picture. There was one with some zebras in it, but that would have been mixed migration. But so finally, is mixed and irregular migration the new global mobility paradigm that we're facing? So this isn't a small issue that we're dealing with today. It's something that is part of a transforming, modernizing world. Thank you for your attention. I hope that wasn't too long. Thank you.
That was very Hello. Yes, very interesting and very controversial. I would like to welcome the next speaker, who is Cindy Horst, who is a research professor at Prio and who is an expert on the Horn of Africa and Kenya. She's an anthropologist, and her current research interests include mobility and conflict, diaspora and humanitarianism, and refugee protection. She's the author of the excellent Transnational Nomads, How Somalis Cope with Refugee Life in the Dadaab Camps of Kenya. And her work has also appeared in African Studies, Journal of Refugee Studies, Ethnicities, and many other outlets. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. So please go ahead.
Can someone help me get this up here? Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much. Welcome again also to Prio. Can everyone hear me at the back? No, I think that's yes. Thank you. Sorry, Martin. I'm really happy that I have a chance here to speak to you, and that I will be able to do this based on about 20 years of research on issues related to refugees. So my task, I think, here is to put refugees back in the picture. And most of my work has been on the Horn of Africa, specifically Somalia. This, by the way, is from is our graphic illustrations from a book on Somalis in European cities, which show some of the experiences that people talked about. First of all, you're here at Prio, the Peace Research Institute Oslo. What we do is we conduct research on the conditions of peaceful relations between states, groups, and individuals. And we also look at the consequences, or the causes as well as the consequences of violent conflict. One of the things that we are then looking at is how violent conflict actually impacts individuals, societies, families, and especially also how people manage to cope with violent conflict. One of the ways in which people cope is actually through migration. And we've been doing research on this for almost 10 years now here at Prio. So I'll talk to you about that, and specifically from my background as an anthropologist. And I was thinking, since we have this distinguished panel of speakers with such different backgrounds and different positions, what is it that I offer? And I think very much as an anthropologist, what I'll try to do is bring the human dimension back in and also allow you to relate to people that seem quite different from us. And I think that's what I can do because I've been conducting interviews and life histories since 1995, mainly with Somali refugees. I've not done, and I have to say this and state this very clearly, I've not done research on what's happening in the Mediterranean. So it's mainly based on these life histories with Somali refugees, which I think still are very important also in understanding what is going on in the Mediterranean. And I'll explain that as well. But in those life histories with refugees, what comes up really, really clearly is how war and displacement actually plays such a central role in those lives. And I've had many horrific stories, but what I think is most remarkable is actually the human capacity to cope, to move on, and also to stay humane. I think that's what has been most amazing, actually, that people in refugee camps stay humane, and they do that mainly by helping others. And that's a way not just of surviving as a community, but it's also a way of maintaining dignity. So by assisting others who are in worse position, it's actually possible to maintain dignity. So I think my main task here is to bring agency back into the picture. I'll give you a number of
quotes from these 2-3 hour interviews I've done with a lot of different people, and I'll explain a bit why those quotes were chosen. And I've tried not to focus on those horrific events that I talked about, because I don't think that's doing the discussion much good. So this is an interview I did quite recently with Ober Aden for the Jensen project. And she talks about the period where they realized the conflict was starting in Mogadishu. And she says, I remember that I did the test, I passed, and I got a place in medicine in Somalia. And my uncle, who worked in the Somali National Bank, bought a really nice school bag. He bought books, everything was ready. But after some days, the war happened. So that was my story. I remember we ate breakfast and my mom and my aunt asked, what shall we take with us? And he said, don't take a lot, just take small things. We will certainly be back in a week or two. I remember that I thought I will not take my school bag. If I take it on the journey, it's definitely going to get spoiled. So I took the bag and I placed it in a very good cupboard. And I took with me some few clothes. I ate breakfast. We just took some small things. And of course, I spoke to her in November 2014 here in Oslo. She's lived in Norway for almost 20 years. She's never returned. She's actually quite scared. She wants to return now because there are increasing numbers of Somalis returning from Oslo to sea to visit Mogadishu. But she's a little bit, yeah, she doesn't like taking risks, I can tell you. And she managed to come to Oslo from Nairobi by plane at that time. She also never managed to study medicine, but she's completed a master's. And she's actually the one person that insisted I use her real name. She's a local politician and she's contributing a lot to Oslo at the moment. Secondly, I called it early warning, an early warning system. And this was an interview I did many years ago with Dahaba Ahmed, in the Dadaab refugee camps of Kenya. And she worked at the time in 1988, she worked for Care International in Mogadishu. And she says, I first noticed sign of war in 1988 when I was pregnant with our firstborn. There were rumors that some roads had been blocked because army people were capturing one area after the other. The food aid at that time also decreased instead of increased. And I saw that the first agency workers were going. A few of them were leaving town already. That is when I suspected that the conditions were worsening. So that was a very good early warning system. The internationals were leaving Mogadishu. And then she explains afterwards how she tried to survive. And she says, from morning to evening, I was thinking about whether I would survive the afternoon or whether I would survive the night. And if I survived the night, I would still wonder whether I would survive the next day. I was worried because people were losing their lives so suddenly. I was too worried to sit, to eat, something to chew, because I feared that people might come and kill me. And I met her in 2002, I think, in Dadaab, where she had lived for many years. Thirdly, this was an interview I did in Nairobi with someone who has a very high position now in Somalia, in the government, whom I call Mohammed Shuki. And he explained how he didn't want to leave, but he had to. I was pressured by my family and friends to leave for many months, but I stayed until July 2008 when I realized I really had to go. 2 of my close friends and colleagues were assassinated, and I knew I was not safe. Both my friends were very active and engaged, and both of them were clearly deliberately targeted. He didn't want to leave because he played such an important role in what was happening, and I was really trying to address the injustices that he saw in Mogadishu, but he at some point really had to do this because he was next. And he stayed in Nairobi for a couple of years until he realized it was safe, and then moved back again. So what do I want to say with this? I think I do want to say something about mobility and self-protection. So what happens when people are faced with violent conflict? How do they cope? Well, one of the ways in which they cope is by moving away from violent conflict. It's a central strategy for individuals to guarantee both their own survival as well as the survival of family members. And at times this is reactive and sudden. At times, all of a sudden, you have to pack up everything and leave. But very often, the decision to migrate or not is something that individuals and families constantly reflect on. And they reflect on it constantly in a conflict situation, but also while they're somewhere else. Because it's this constant, okay, where am I safe? What information can I trust? What do I know? What will happen here in Mogadishu? What will happen if I move to Kismayo? And then, okay, maybe you take the risk, and then you're in Kismayo and you find war breaks out. Then where do you go? So it's this constant reflecting on, how do I use migration to be safe and to have my family be safe? And now, obviously, I'm specifically talking about people who are caught up in armed conflict or specifically targeted, persecuted individually. In these migration decisions, people balance both security needs and also livelihood survival. Obviously, if you bring your family to somewhere where there's no violent conflict, but they have nothing to eat, your children are going to die of starvation, that is also not an option. So they have to balance security needs with livelihood survival. And for those affected, then protection is both physical safety, but also basic needs. And those decisions are rarely based on individual protection concerns. They are decisions that are made on a family level. And this is because different family members face different risks, and they have also access to different strategies to protect themselves. And I'll show you some examples of that, where it's mainly parents who make decisions about where their children might be safe. This is from an interview done in Hargeisa, in a camp for internal displaced people. A lady also from Mogadishu who says, but the problem was that Al-Shabaab had their eyes on my son. He was only a teenager, did nothing wrong, but they had accused him of being against Islam, and they wanted to take him to sentence him. I would not have been a good mother to my son if I had let Al-Shabaab take him. So she decided to move because there was a risk that the boy would be taken by Al-Shabaab. I also know of other stories where someone in Oslo, for example, says, okay, I sent money to my brother because I was afraid that he would actually join Al-Shabaab. So not be forced to join, but join because that was the best livelihood opportunity he had. So I got him out of there. I made sure that he's now in Ethiopia, and at least that is not a risk I have to face. And Uba also talked about what happened when they moved to Kenya. And she says, my mother and relatives had already reached the decision to send all the young women in the camp or in the family to Kenya right away, as there were reports of widespread rape in the city. So there was also this consideration that, okay, well, young women face particular challenges, particular risks that families wanted to protect them against. So how do I move now from the Horn to the Mediterranean? Why is all of this relevant? Why am I trying to put refugees back into the picture? When maybe, okay, we're talking about, I'm specifically doing research on Somali refugees, and they're a small number at the moment. But I think these stories illustrate that the need to flee conflict zones is often non-negotiable. If you know that your family is not safe, your children are not safe, you leave, and you have very little option. The question of where you move to, of course, that depends on so many different factors. And where are you safe? Where are you protected? There, of course, the security risks are important, and that's the security risks along the way. Which journey can you take? What do you know about these different countries? And of course, if you look at the map of Horn of Africa and where that's situated and which countries are there around, you know that the options are not that great, because many of the countries along the route are themselves in conflict. And also very often, well, do you actually have sufficient information? What kind of rumors are there? People are constantly after, like, where is the information that will tell me where I'm going to be safe? So security risks. Obviously survival chances. If you know that you have to walk through a desert for 2 weeks with your kids, well, that means that maybe you shouldn't. So where is it that you can actually know that your family is going to be safe, that you're going to be safe? It might also mean that you have to split up the family and decide, okay, well, the younger man might have a better chance in surviving. The children should go somewhere else and be, for example, staying in a refugee camp. So the family composition is very crucial. The individual risks, the survival chances is very central here as well. Obviously, also economic resources. It costs more the further you go. If you want to go all the way to Norway, that costs a lot of money. So that really determines where you're actually going to end up. And then something that Chris also pointed to, family members abroad. Do you have people who can help you get those resources, but also do you have a mother, a sister, a brother that you would like to live with? And also that can tell you, okay, here it's a good place to live. At the same time, of course, I mean, most refugees are hosted regionally. So that's true for Somalis, that's true for Ethiopians. And part of that is most wish to stay close. Especially in the beginning of a conflict, many people feel that, well, this is going to pass. A lot of the people I spoke to in Dadaab were like, well, I was thinking it was going to end. I didn't want to uproot my family. I don't want my children to become Americanized. I prefer for them to stay here, stay close, but then it continues and continues and continues. So this idea of temporariness also is an important factor in people choosing to stay close. But at the same time, there is also, even for those who want to move, there is a lack of resources and also a lack of access. You see that there's an increasing restriction in moving to particular other countries. At the same time, the regional protection has many challenges. First of all, these countries are in regional environments where violent conflict is quite widespread. And that is not just the case in the Horn of Africa. It's the same for Syrians, it's the same for many places in West Africa as well. And then very often there is a regional dynamics to the conflict. So for the Somali conflict, for example, the Kenyans, where Dadaab refugee camps host over 500,000 Somali refugees, at the same time the Kenyan government is actually military engaged in South Central Somalia and has an interest. At the same time, of course, there's security threats, various Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya as well. So the regional dynamics is quite complex, and actually refugees are part of those dynamics. So very recently, the Kenyan government, for example, yet again said that within 3 months, Dadaab should be closed. And those 500,000 refugees should just go back. Now they've come back to it, but it's a constant a struggle where conflict dynamics are very regional and refugees are part of that. Other aspects of these protection challenges regionally is that there is a risk of detention and refoulement. So when you get protection regionally, many people, for example, in Libya actually ended up in detention in very bad conditions and also run the risks of being sent back without a fair looking at the application or looking at the refugee rights that they might have. And finally, also particular individuals run particular risks. So you might see that in Dadaab, for example, the refugee camps, a number of high military officials were executed by the government from the country which they fled because of kind of the political position that they held. And that's much easier to do in the region. So some people don't actually get safety regionally. At the same time, we see an increasing call for regional solutions. And you see that both from civil society and also from governments. So one of the things that I've observed is that a range of also Norwegian NGOs are fundraising for regional programs, suggesting that this actually prevents people from crossing. So it becomes a fundraising strategy. Governments, there is the Khartoum process, which is the EU Horn of Africa migration route initiative that actually focuses on externalizing border control through agreements with countries like Kenya and Eritrea. And of course, Kenya is quite unwilling to host refugees. Eritrea is a country that produces refugees, if you could say, and also it's quite, there is in Eritrea, the border guards have this shoot to kill order for everyone leaving Eritrea without permission. So going into agreements on migration control with a country like Eritrea gives them a stronger position also to control their migration even more. And sending people back to Eritrea and seeing that as a European solution, I think is quite problematic. So my conclusions. First of all, I thought what I wanted to show with these life histories is that refugees are ordinary people who are caught up in extraordinary circumstances. And I think one reason for the difficulty of seeing that is that they are circumstances that are man-made. It's much easier to relate to people who are faced with natural crisis, because then, okay, this is something beyond their fault, etc. But if you look at it as man-made circumstances, it becomes really, I guess, a way of surviving to distinguish yourself from those people, so that it's not something that can happen to anyone. It's very difficult to acknowledge that, I think. And secondly, I mean, I clearly wanted to show that one of the most effective strategies by which civilians who are caught up in war protect themselves and also their vulnerable family members is to move away from conflict zones. So the question is, where do they move to and where can they move to? Needless to say that amongst the people who put their lives in danger in overcrowded boats are refugees who find no regional protection. So the protection of human rights and adherence to international refugee law needs to be a central element of any potential solution to the humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean. And I thought, because it's not enough to just explain some of the drivers of migration without thinking of potential solutions or coming up with recommendations, I felt these two sources very useful: the FEPS policy brief and the PACO position on the need to create legal avenues. Firstly, saying that it's really important to develop effective solidarity mechanisms that enable an equitable distribution both worldwide and also within Europe. Secondly, obviously there needs to be more legal ways of entering the EU and more safe ways in order to seek asylum. And there are a couple of suggestions that were made there that I think are useful, and some of those are already explored. So issuing humanitarian visa in the regions, having an EU-wide resettlement scheme where countries are expected to take certain numbers according to their ability, exemptions from visa obligations and carrier liability. I think that's very important as well, so that people can do like Uber, for example, and come by plane, and then their cases can be processed. And then finally, it's obvious that we need to invest simultaneously in longer term solutions that tackle root causes. And I think that needs to be from the understanding that the responsibility for and the consequences of the humanitarian crisis are shared. And I feel that the strongest way in which this was illustrated was also this Aftenposten picture of the Eritrean boy that was taken up by this Greek fisherman with a Norwegian lure. And that was a Norwegian lure because his uncle had to come and get the corpse for his sister and nephew from Greece. And it really shows that, okay, well, Norwegian citizens are actually affected by what is happening in the Mediterranean, let alone, obviously, the Norwegian government as well. But there are responsibilities and consequences that we all share. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for this very comprehensive view on the rationalities of mobility. And I would like to welcome yet a third perspective, Professor Jürgen Carling, who is a research professor at Prio and a geographer, and is interested in migration, human smuggling, among other. And he's a prolific author. His work has appeared in International Migration Review and Migration Studies, among many other. And your presentation is entitled Migration Desires, Migration Risks, and the Roles of People Smugglers. So please, go ahead.
Thank you.
And I should just inform you that you have a little bit more time because we were ahead of schedule. So take your 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. So I think we're off to a very good start. We've had two really inspiring presentations, and I see the whole day as sort of piecing together a puzzle with complementary perspectives and input. So I'll keep us moving in that direction, and I'm glad to say that I can reconnect with some of the points that have been made already, and I'm sure that others can keep connecting through the rest of the day. I will try to do this around three key questions. So I'm asking three questions, and the first one is this very fundamental one. We've had some answers already, but I think it's a useful analytical question to keep coming back to. So why do people make these dangerous journeys to Europe by boat? And of course, we can talk to individuals like Cindy did, which will give us sort of the in-depth perspectives of people's experiences. And we can try to draw conclusions from the big picture as well. And one way to access the big picture, of course, is to ask, where did these people come from? So this is a map showing last year's arrivals by boat. The 10 largest nationalities, but the third one is actually the large group of Africans who haven't been identified as citizens of a particular country. So we see Syria being big, but not more than a third of the total. So this tendency to immediately link the current crisis to Syria is a little bit misguided. Not only because it's been going on for much longer than the Syrian conflict, but also because even now, Syrians are, after all, a minority of the total. And I think this also illustrates the diversity of situations that people leave. If we relate this to the population size of the countries that people are moving from, we see how tiny Gambia is actually responsible for a large number of people crossing. These trends fluctuate quite a lot. So I've added to this map the 9 other countries that have been on the top 10 list during the past 5 years. And there we see even greater diversity. Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iraq, Tunisia, Albania, Morocco. All of these have at some point during the past 5 years been among the top 10 arrivals. So I think it's true to say that these are definitely mixed flows in different respects, not only with respect to our own legislative and administrative categories, but also in terms of the situations that people leave and the risks that they take. So is there any common element that we can point to across all of these diverse situations? And I'm raising that question because we also very easily fall into this dichotomized view of some people as genuine refugees and others as fortune seekers. And it is, I think, more mixed also in that respect, in that our categories are distinct, but people's actual experiences and motivations are not. And what it is that makes people turn to migration is a question that we've explored in different research projects here at Prio. And one thing that I think comes up is that when people are in a difficult situation, a dangerous situation, a degrading situation, a situation that frustrates them or makes them feel that they have to do something, they always have a diversity of possible causes of action. If they're under danger, they could try to stay safe where they are in some ways. Some people have to do. If they can't feed their children, they could try to make money by working. They could go and rob someone. They always have different possibilities. But migration very often stands out as offering the cleanest break from the current situation. It's not a matter of trying to make ends meet and making things a little bit better. It's about really doing something different, getting out of the situation. It also offers hope in a different way. And I think that's a crucial aspect of understanding migration dynamics, that it offers hope more than many of the other courses of action that people can take. And finally, of course, there is also an element of despair that's important. And it's obviously more important in some contexts than others, as both Cindy and Chris pointed to. But the element of despair is also linked to the migration dynamics and the control mechanisms, in the sense that more and more people have to take very circuitous routes to even get to where the boats are. So this is how many Syrians, for instance, have traveled to reach Lampedusa. And of course, by the time they're on the coastline of Libya, they've spent a lot of money, they've spent a lot of time, they've taken many risks. And this is where they are in Libya. And of course, if they came from the war in Syria, maybe destitution or desperation was a driving force at the outset. But it's certainly as big when they are in Libya and have very little to return to, and a very high opportunity cost in the sense of what they lose if they don't make that last final leg of the journey. But even people who didn't really leave out of desperation, but left with a sense of hope, might find themselves then in a situation of desperation at various points along the journey. Now, I've also noted this thing that Chris pointed to, which I think has received remarkably little attention, that we focus on the deaths, which are in record numbers and obviously terrible in every single case. But in terms of understanding the dynamics of it, this is the important picture, that it's a risk worth taking when this is where you are, 1,000 miles from home, having invested a lot of money already, nothing to return to, and everything that is about hope is ahead of you, and this is the risk that you have to take. So our work, of course, has to be to reduce that little white slice to zero. But we can still work on that and make that the primary objective, and still understand that its small size is important for the dynamics of what's happening. Now we know that the origins are diverse. And this is the sort of typical migrant that we imagined 10 years ago or less, when most people left West Africa with the hope of a better life in Europe, and most of them didn't escape a conflict. And at the time, mixed migration was a problem, mainly in the sense that in these boats, there might be 1 or 2 people who actually qualified for protection. And we had to make sure that the control measures didn't prevent their opportunities for seeking protection. Chris mentioned that mixed migration is, in a way, the core of the problem. But I think the core of the problem now, and the reason why it's such a big issue on political agendas today, is that the mix has shifted quite dramatically. So now this figure is much more marginal. And this is the picture that dominates the discussion. I'm hesitating a little bit because I'm again playing with this dichotomy of 2 different types of migrants. And of course, this guy could also be living in a conflict zone and be subject to potential extortion, radicalization, and violence, and other things. But still, in terms of our political discourse, the awareness that most of these people are escaping conflict, most of them would have to be given protection in Europe if they come here, or at least very many of them, that has changed the dynamic. And that brings me to the second question, which is, I think, the most fundamental of all, which is, can Europe really have it both ways in the way that we're trying at the moment. And by that, I mean, we want to have the asylum system, but not the asylum seekers. We want to have the refugee convention, but we don't want the refugees. And that's really at the core of European policy, trying to bring those two wishes together. And luckily for us, there's a sea in between that actually helps to sustain this impossible situation of having it both ways. But because of boats, the sea is not enough. So we've made sure that on land borders there are fences and landmines. We've also made sure that everyone who comes from a potentially refugee-producing country needs a visa to come to Europe. And we've also ensured that if they apply for a visa, then their very need of protection is the grounds for rejecting that visa. And we've made sure that no one just comes and arrives at the border without a visa and applies for asylum, because we have these carrier sanctions. And we've even made sure that it's difficult to get to the transit countries by helping them help us by, for instance, introducing visa requirements for third country nationals who might be transiting through, say, Morocco or Turkey. So all of these measures are ways of trying to have it both ways. And then the smugglers are the ones who destroy this balance. And so you could really say that, in a way, what the smugglers are doing is enforcing consistency, in the sense that because of the smugglers, we can no longer have the refugee convention without also having the refugees. So this is, I think, the question that's pushed into the background by making it into an operational issue and trying to find operational challenges, because this is really the problem that we have to address in the long term. And my last question then is why these smugglers are so evil, because we've really heard a lot about how they are the scum of the earth. As one IOM person put it, they have nothing but cynicism in their hearts. And this is not specific to specific types of smugglers. They are the human smugglers in general who belong to this category of people. And it's not just a matter of scapegoating. That's too simple a term, because there's more of a dynamic involved here, and I'm trying to map it out to explain what I think is going on. I think it all starts with this call for action that you pointed to at the opening, that no action is not an option. So we can imagine European leaders meeting, and I'm sure the number one point in their head is that we have to come up with something. And of course, the alternatives are not that many, at least not the politically viable ones. So then the easiest action is to fight human smuggling. And that's really propelled also by this lack of alternatives. Because what we could think of as alternatives, providing safe routes, or just sending them all back, or doing as Thailand has done recently and refused to relate to them, all of those things are politically impossible in one direction or the other. And then when you have to do something and you can't do this, then you can do that. But this is much more effective if you at the same time demonize these smugglers and show that they are really subhuman. They are, as our current Prime Minister put it about 10 years ago when she introduced the current legislation that we have, human smuggling represents, cynical exploitation of people in need. Well, it can do that, but it also enables those people to seek protection. But this demonization of the smugglers is a consistent feature, and it's unfortunately supported by the media very often, in the sense that all these stories about what's happening become so much more exciting, readable, when you have these stories about the horrible human smugglers who do terrible things and earn enormous amounts of money. And you can, I haven't done a proper discourse analysis of it, but I would love to see how every characteristic is turned against the smugglers. So if the boats are small, the smugglers are sending people out on tiny boats. And if the boats are big, then the smugglers are using enormous ships. And if the boats are bad, then the reckless smugglers are risking people's lives. If they have top equipment, it shows that they are organized, powerful mafias. So every characteristic can be used to support this. And there we see this harmony between the leaders of Europe and the media who feed on this entertaining narrative. And this combination reduces the burden of responsibility for European leaders. Because now we have these terrible people who are to blame, and we are taking action against them. So by introducing this into the picture, the European leaders become the heroes of the stories, who really stand up for the migrants and protect them against these terrible smugglers. So that's how I think this is really a crucial piece of a bigger picture of politics and policy. But of course, many smugglers also do terrible things to the people in their care. So I think just as we shouldn't say they're all terrible, I'm not saying they're all wonderful people either. The point is to differentiate. And that's not something that European policymakers are good at the moment. But I think this is a useful framework for adding some differentiation into it. We can think of different people who are somehow orchestrating migrants' movements or interacting with them, and that they could be exercising different degrees of facilitation in terms of facilitating movement, and exploitation in terms of exploiting the migrants. And in a way, the typical human smuggler that we think of is to some extent doing both, in the sense that they put migrants on a boat to Europe that will most likely take them to Europe and provide them with protection. But they charge enormous amounts of money, and they don't ensure security on board. So in that sense, you could say that it's exploitative because they see this as a money-making opportunity. But of course, you should also think of the incentives the smugglers have, and we keep hearing that it's a low-risk, high-gain business model, but that's not actually so in the Mediterranean. If a smuggler decided that I really have to take care of my passengers, I will guide them safely through shore and hand them over to Italian authorities, then he would risk 10 years in jail. Why would he do that instead of escaping on a small vessel along the way? So we have these smugglers who are perhaps doing both. And then we also have people not responsible for the big numbers that we're seeing now, but still part of the picture, who just help others. And they are also struck by the same legislation that we have. So even if you help a refugee enter Europe and you're not making money from it, you would be convicted of human smuggling. And finally, another piece of the picture that I'm glad you mentioned, which is virtually absent from European policy, is all the people who only exploit migrants and don't facilitate their movement in any way. And of course, the people who kidnap, especially Eritreans, but also other groups in North Africa, are the primary example of this group. And that's something we also see, for instance, in Mexico and southern US, where some of the children that we read about last year who came from Central America in large numbers and successfully entered the US were kidnapped inside the US and held for ransom from relatives in other parts of the US. So there are a lot of dangers to migrants that are caused by people who are in no way human smugglers and who are not facilitating their movement, but who are only exploiting them. And that's where our attention should also be. So I'll end by bringing us back to the title of the seminar and try to relate this to what we are doing and could be doing. And of course, humanitarian crisis is a strong word or a strong term. So, you think this is really where we should address our policies. And as says Secretary said, you know, this should be our primary objective, to save lives and to take humanitarian responsibility. But I think primarily because of the dynamics of how the smugglers are placed in the picture and how we're meeting the challenge, this is not where the attention is, but instead the policies are doing this. So by blocking the smuggling routes, we're not really solving the problem, but it's no longer on the doorsteps of Europe. And that's really the dangerous aspect of the dominant line of policy that we see at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you so much, Jürgen. This was fascinating. And particularly, you know, the tensions between yours and Chris's view on the smuggler and on the level of criminality, and how we are currently entering something like the European war on smugglers instead of, you know, the global war on terror, and how the smuggler is being portrayed basically as the new terrorist. And I'm sure we're going to get to this later in the day, but if boat destruction is on the agenda, that raises a whole different set of questions. I'm very pleased to introduce our third speaker. Ruben Andersen is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of International Development at LSE. He's an expert in irregular migration and Euro-African border control. He's an anthropologist, and his work has appeared in American Anthropologist and Anthropology Quarterly, among other. And as of last night, this book has gone to the top of my reading list. So please take a flyer and read it. And I'm very happy to welcome you to give the talk, Policing Migration, a View from the South.
Well, thanks a lot. I should say, first of all, thanks a lot to Prio for organizing this event. I think it's highly timely and is a very interesting chance to exchange views from practitioners among academics, politicians, and I'm already learning a lot here today. So I'm going to really pick up the baton here from Jürgen's interesting presentation and his talk about smugglers and their role, and the role of the crackdown on smugglers in the dynamics of irregular migration in Europe's neighborhood. And I'm going to be focusing on another key aspect of that, which is often quite neglected, and that's the negative impact that Europe's security response to migration has had on migration dynamics in Europe's wider neighborhood. So I'll say a few words on that today. We see now over the past few months what we call in this event a humanitarian crisis, how politicians really scrambling for a response here and trying in different ways to provide those quick solutions, calls for action, as Jürgen called them, trying to show some steadfast resolve in addressing the situation. And one key plank of action, besides the crackdowns on smugglers, a highly simplistic crackdown on smugglers, I should say, is more collaboration with African states in policing migration, in further crackdowns on smugglers inland, in halting migration flows upstream, as it were. We heard in earlier months, and this is a proposal that seems to have fallen by the wayside now, about the idea for offshore processing centers in North Africa for refugees. But now with last week's agenda on migration on European Union level, we hear about other proposals. We hear about migration liaison officers, EU migration liaison officers, stationed in third states, working on border management, pushing for more migration controls in these countries, pushing for more action against smuggling routes, more collaboration in border management, and so on and so forth. We also hear about ideas for a pilot reception centers for migrants in transit in Niger, and this is at the center of the map here on the route towards Libya, which would involve receiving migrants in transit, trying to convince them to sort of settle in the region and also inform them about the risks of the journey. So I have that type of initiative of making African states collaborate in halting these flows upstream. This might also sound quite reasonable on paper, but in fact what we forget, and I think is a case here of serial amnesia in Europe, in both our public debate and among politicians, in that these types of initiatives have been tried already numerous times over the past decade or more. And in fact, this very map is an example of that. It's called the IMAP, and it's a map produced to track and trace migrant routes through the desert from sub-Saharan Africa towards Europe. And it's really been one of the tools used by border agencies, including the EU Frontex border agency, to look at cutting flows upstream in earlier years. So I think what we're really seeing is, again, as Jürgen indicated, a scramble for a call for action and politicians grabbing what looks like a steadfast, strong solution, which besides the crackdowns on smugglers involves then more policing in Africa, pushing this to a distance, putting a distance between the border and these flows of people. The problem here is that it's not just an old strategy, but it's actually failed repeatedly also in the past decade. And I'm going to try to show how it's failed and how it's in fact become a key factor in creating the type of crisis we're now seeing at the borders. It's been counterproductive. I'm afraid I only have one slide, so you'll have to keep staring at this map for a while, but it's interesting enough as it is. So just to give you a brief backstory, I think we already heard quite a lot about the history here, about the drivers, about the dynamics in the sort of long to medium term. But let's recall that it's only in the 1990s, with the closure of the external EU borders and the Schengen Agreement of free movement within Europe, that we start to see this type of boat migration along southern European shores. It's no coincidence that the first year when we saw regular arrivals of migrant boats in southern Europe, 1991, in Spain, was the same year when Spain instituted visa requirements for North Africans. So there's a clear parallel there in the growth of these clandestine entry routes and the policies and the possibilities of migrating legally into Europe. So in the 1990s, these routes were really dominated by North Africans, haragas, as you know, and burners of borders. And then from around the year 2000 onwards, we started to see more sub-Saharan migrants coming onto these routes for complex reasons, partly to do with difficulties in North Africa, riots in Libya and so on, difficult living conditions in countries where many of them were in fact already working and settled. And this, especially these sub-Saharan migrants, who are numerically quite small statistically, we have to remember, and especially so in earlier years. Only a very small minority, we should recall, of immigrants in Europe enter by sea, and only a very small minority of all West African migrants, a region of concern to my work and to many policymakers, migrate towards Europe. Most stay within their own home region, move between countries in their home region. So we have quite a disproportionate attention to these flows over many years, despite the statistical smallness of the phenomenon. We've seen then, since the early 2000s, more and more policing and policy efforts to halt migratory flows. We've seen collaboration develop with North African states. Spain has taken the lead here, and in Spain I've been focusing on in my research and routes from West Africa towards Spain. We've seen border fences, we heard about them before, Jürgen talked about them, razor wire put up around Spain's North African enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, and more border policing cooperation a decade ago with Morocco, pushing routes further south towards the Atlantic route, towards the Spanish Canary Islands off the West African coast. We also had, and we heard about that earlier on, the Rabat process from 2006, which involved sort of more liberal, you can say, aspects of migration and development, protection of refugees, but crucially also policing of migration, externalization of border controls into African territories. And we've seen a similar thing happening now, as we heard, with the Khartoum process in the Horn of Africa. So the key idea in these collaborations, and has for more than a decade been, to subcontract and externalize the coercive policing of migratory routes into African territory, putting a distance between our borders, as we heard, and these migratory flows. And again, this might sound quite neat on paper, quite a suitable solution, but in fact, it's generated a whole host of problems. And I'm just going to try to run through a couple of them here. First of all, it's created a real problem of accountability, because what we have now is a situation where policing of migratory flows is occurring to some extent on Europe's behalf in territories where we have very little transparency. We don't know what's happening. The abuse, human rights abuses occurring in many of these transit countries in these borderlands are not accounted for. There's very little control and very little recourse or redress for any migrants or refugees suffering such abuses. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of the repeated arbitrary and collective expulsions engaged in by Morocco to the borderlands with Algeria, by Algeria to the Sahara Desert, and the long, prolonged detentions in countries such as Libya of migrants and asylum seekers or refugees over many years. And this has happened at a time of very strong bilateral cooperation on migration with European states, such as Spain and Italy. So that's one aspect of this, the accountability problem. And another, perhaps more fundamental political problem is that we have, through this type of collaborations, exported the idea of migration as a security problem, as a threat to neighboring countries, which have their own mobility dynamics, which have in fact themselves often long been important migrant destinations in their own right. And that's the case not least in Libya. I tend to forget that now. I mean, the crisis, the chaos, the conflict, but for many years in the Gaddafi era, there was a major labor importer, not least from sub-Saharan Africa, many, many migrants coming there to work, to live, with no intention of going further into Europe. And again, as I said, in West Africa, similar case, a lot of intra-regional mobility, far outpacing the arrivals in Europe. And finally, this type of export of the migrant security problem has involved some quite unforeseen effects. And one of these concerns the fact that we now created an incentive for neighboring states to play on this fear of migration, to use migration as a bargaining chip in relations with Europe, and so contributing to maintaining often the pressure at Europe's borders. So we see that case of the use of this quite simplistic label of the transit state for political and economic ends at work in North Africa. We've seen it in Morocco, in a very subtle process over many years of using what some commentators have called the country's geographical wrench, situated on the cusp of Africa, the gates of Europe, to extract concessions from Europe, from Spain, in fields such as trade, fishing agreements, aid, thorny diplomatic question of Western Sahara, occupied Western Sahara, as well as mobility for their own citizens. You have now an EU mobility partnership with Morocco, involving, in theory, some limited mobility for Moroccan workers, but that involves clauses on controlling irregular migration, on strengthening border management, on targeting, in that sense, non-Moroccans on Moroccan soil, as well as a future possibility of a readmission agreement of third country nationals back into Morocco. And similar things happening elsewhere in Tunisia, Turkey, and so on. Another example, Libya, as I said, long and important migrant destination. We saw in earlier years, in the Gaddafi era, the blatant usage of migrants as a bargaining chip in relations with Europe. He asked for billions of euros a year in order to stop Europe turning black at one point. And we now have a legacy, I think, of that instrumentalization of migration, of that blatant usage of migrants as a bargaining chip in what we're seeing now in the conflict. Migrants are treated as fair game by pretty much everyone, by militias, security forces, bandits. They are really at the mercy of forces who not only may kidnap them, as in the case of some of these criminal rings, but will also detain them indefinitely in detention camps until they or their families pay a liberation fee. So very, on the official side as well, we have a very similar dynamic going on, as well as a vying for control of the coastal areas, a vying for power in relation to Europe now, saying, well, we can control this slice of coastline and so on. Another example, Mauritania, a desert state, a vast desert state with a tiny population on the West African coast, which became an important departure point for boat migrants around 2006 after the routes had been pushed down from the Strait of Gibraltar to a much longer, more dangerous route to the Canary Islands. It's a country that's long, is a tiny population, as I said, is dependent on migrant labor from West Africa, Senegal, Mali, and so on, for years, for decades, in many of its sectors, in fishing, services, and so on. But it has, since it started, border cooperation with Spain in particular since 2006, involving patrolling, policing, more detentions, deportations down to the southern borders, made life increasingly difficult for West African migrants are in fact a key component of the local economy. It's also affected regional diplomatic relations in that, of course, having Mauritania and Senegal in this deportation and border control conflict of interest is not beneficial to either of them really in the long run. But this has all been facilitated by the focus on the so-called fight against irregular migration from Europe. It all sounds a bit gloomy here. We do have one success case we heard about earlier on as well, which is the route towards the Canary Islands from Mauritania and Senegal. And a success case simply in the official sense of halting this route, of stemming arrivals, pretty much like Australia is now doing the other side of the world. Well, this is then a model for the rest of Europe. I already indicated some reasons why it's not, in that you're affecting negatively, you're undermining regional mobility, you're creating very entrenched, very risky regional political dynamics. But there are also other side effects to this type of success story. And this is what I've been looking at to some extent in my research. We've had for now since 2006 Frontex joint operation on the open seas here called Joint Operation Hera, involving the patrolling of African coasts by Spanish civil guards, Frontex vessels and African security forces collaborating together, as well as deportations from the Canary Islands back towards West Africa. It's just been held up for many years as a benchmark in this type of collaboration with African states. We often forget what's going on behind the scenes here, which was, from the Spanish side, the lavishing of all sorts of gifts onto their reluctant African hosts. For instance, policing equipment for the security forces, extra pay to patrol migration, both along the coasts and inland in Africa, in Mali, in Senegal, Mauritania, as well as sweeteners in terms of development aid. They suddenly set up embassies across the region, launched development programs, a very ambitious Africa plan for development, all on the back of this concern with fighting irregular migration, an instrumentalized use of development aid here going on. So it's quite a big political and financial investment of Spain in getting these countries on board, in both deportations and in controlling migration in this highly mobile region, as I said. Success here really owed a lot to the very weak bargaining position of these states. Let's remember Mauritania, Mali, Gambia, Guinea, also Senegal to some extent are poor nations, much poorer certainly than North African countries who have a lot more at stake in migration, who have a lot more resources to draw on, who will not be as easily convinced to collaborate in this sense as were the West Africans back in 2006. So it's very hard to extend this model elsewhere. And by the way, that's a similar case in Australia, and involved very poor Papua New Guinea and so on in offshore processing. It's very hard to extend that to North Africa. Even so, with this ease of collaboration, I heard a lot of stories during my fieldwork, and this is a view from the south, from my title, I suppose, of how border police in Senegal or in Mali were quite discontent with the resources they were giving to patrol migration. They wanted more funding, more resources, more equipment. The Europeans were not stepping up to the plate. They were not doing enough. There's always a call for more and more resources to do this and to keep them happy, to keep them on board. We're creating a circular relationship here based around this control of these migratory flows. Similarly, among locals, potential migrants, actual migrants, and deported migrants, we also see a very clear awareness of what's going on here in terms of, before, this industry of migration controls, as they saw it. Deportees, for instance, I talked to, everyone's eating from migration in their words, and that's not just the border police, it's also the aid sector working on risk awareness, highlighting the risks of irregular migration and so on, and politicians, ministries, everyone with a finger in this border control pie. This is quite ironic, the whole focus on risk awareness, I should say, by the way, because as we heard earlier on as well, people are quite aware of these risks of the journey. And in fact, there was a key part of why many of them embarked, was to prove that they were ready to risk their life for their families, to make something of their life. And in fact, the motto for these boat journeys was Barça wala Barzakh in Wolof, which is Barcelona or death. Kind of says it all, I think. So, and a final reason for the success, very quickly, in terms of deportations, was that the Canary Islands, let's remember, it's very far from European shores. It's quite easy to deport people. You cannot, again, replicate that model very easily in an onshore, if you will, European settings. That's another part of the puzzle. Anyway, quick return to the present here and what I said from the migration agenda. The focus on Niger, on a new reception center, more border management, border control, also risk awareness among migrants. We already said that migrants are often very well aware of the risks, thank you very much. And they also have very little intention of settling down in a very poor, insecure country such as Niger. But another aspect of this, as I mentioned, is that the more we focus on these migration controls within the region, the more unhospitable we're going to make life for migrants here. So we're actually undermining that very objective by focusing so much on border controls. And finally, the focus on routes through Niger now, and that route also highlights another key side effect of this success story on the Atlantic, which was that, again, as has happened with Morocco to the Atlantic, now we had a push displacement effect from the Atlantic into the deadly and very dangerous Sahara Desert. We're not actually solving anything. We're pushing the problem around, creating more risks for migrants, and also pushing people into the hands of ever stronger smuggling rings to keep growing as border controls become more difficult. You're creating a captive market where people have very little recourse to other solutions than to fall into the hands of these smuggling networks. To sum up then, we keep hearing about these African collaborations in policing as solving something, but in fact, as I'm saying here, we're actually creating a vicious cycle here of more investments, more controls, and the failure of these controls feeding demands for ever more controls of the same type. We keep repeating the same solution again and again, hoping for a different result the next time. It's not going to happen. It's going to keep coming back to bite us. I think we can break this cycle by a different type of cooperation. We can, of course, continue and increase support for the very large refugee receivers, say in Syria's neighborhood, who take in the vast majority of the world's refugees. Europe is not doing that. Countries such as Lebanon, with 1 million Syrians in it, are doing that. We need to increase support there. We also crucially need to create some legal pathways into Europe, not least to undermine the smuggling business, because if we don't leave any way out, we're going to increase the profits in that business. We're going to increase the hold on migrants and refugees within that market. We also need to start shifting down the rhetoric, de-escalating, normalizing migration in a sense. And that might involve, for instance, pushing for a decriminalization of irregular migration, which now is criminalized in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, for instance. We heard about the Horn of Africa earlier on, and that's partly because of this cooperation in European border controls that we have that very hostile environment there. Similarly, pushing for better reception conditions in countries such as Egypt will also be key to improve the situation, improve, again, regional mobility and regional possibilities. So to sum up, after a couple of words, we need to start reframing migration not as a security issue in need of more policing cooperation, but instead as a complex socio-economic force that can actually yield substantial benefits both to Europe and to the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben, for a fascinating presentation, giving us yet another piece of the puzzle on the construction of migration as a security problem, on the migration industry, and the West African perspective. I think all the panelists have done a wonderful job of presenting the various dynamics of migration. I'll use the chair's prerogative and declare that we're going to have our coffee break now. I think our heads are quite full. I'll see you back here at 12:20, and then we will let the panelists comment on each other's perspectives, presentations, and then we will open the floor for questions. Yes, 11:20. That is correct. Thank you.